We've been in the series for a while called Into the Fire. It's a series where we're studying the book of Daniel. And the concept that we started with, and this is to be a little bit of a review, is that the fire represents that place of uncomfortability or that place of discomfort, that place of frustration, hardship, whatever. Usually we face decisions that give us two options. And those two options are to pick a path that leads us closer to God's will for us, or to pick a path that leads us further from God's will for us. To pick a path of the right decision or the wrong decision. And quite frequently, the path of the right decision leads us apparently to a place of fire, a place of difficulty, hardship, frustration, or something like that. And the place of the wrong choice actually leads to a place of comfort. At least that's the way we perceive our choices. We look at all of our choices through this lens. This one might be God's will, but it's discomfort. And this one might be my will, but it's more comfort. And we put everything through that grid. Well, as we've been looking in the book of Daniel, we've seen this same story play out time and time again, where the people who look like they're going into a place of fire end up meeting God there, and He leads them through to a place of blessing on the other side. And the people who look like they're choosing the path of comfort end up finding a place of fire anyway, as God brings testing and sometimes even judgment onto their lives. We've seen this play out many times in the book of Daniel, from Daniel chapter 1 through chapter 6. In fact, this is the summary of what we've seen. 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 have all basically told us the same story. It'll be up here on the screen. It says this: a conquering king issues a decree. The decree opposes God and God's people. God's faithful people face a fiery trial. In fact, literally in one case, when Nebuchadnezzar threw a bunch of guys into a fiery furnace, God's faithful people face a fiery trial, and then God shows up and vindicates His people. This has happened time and time again. And we have seen, as we've gone through these first 6 chapters of Daniel, that the reason this story shows up over and over is that God has a lesson He's trying to get us to learn. And hopefully by now you've already picked up on this lesson. Hopefully by now this lesson is beginning to get ingrained in you a little bit. But the key lesson for the entire book of Daniel, and especially the first few chapters that we've already seen, is this: that despite all appearances, God is still in charge. Despite all appearances, God is in charge. And though it looks like you might be walking into a place of fire, if God is in charge and you're picking His path, then He's going to lead you to a better place on the other side. And even though it looks like you're choosing a path of comfort, if God's in charge, then He's going to bring about His will with or without you. And that's just the way it works. And so for 6 chapters now, we've learned this lesson through stories. But in Daniel chapter 7, it all gets weird. If you're familiar with the book of Daniel, if you read it this week, or if you're familiar at all with it, you know that at chapter 7, crazy things start happening. In fact, chapter 7 switches entirely from narrative stories to a completely different kind of literature. If you're studying the Bible from a kind of a literary perspective, you find in Daniel chapter 7 2 things. One is prophecy, but this is a specific kind of prophecy. Now remember, anytime the Bible uses the word prophecy, that just basically means a message from God came to a person, that person gave it to someone else. That's what prophecy is. It doesn't mean telling the future or anything like that. But when you get to Daniel 7, this is a special kind of prophecy that falls under a different category of literature. And here's a big word for you, a Greek word: apocalyptic is the type of literature. Now this is fascinating because in the Old Testament, it only shows up a couple times. In the New Testament, it shows up in a book that is called the Apocalypse, or we know it by its English translation, Revelation. The last book of the Bible is actually an apocalyptic literature, and Daniel chapter 7 begins that too. Our common day understanding of this word means that we're talking now about end time stuff. You know, when God comes and He puts the beat down on the whole world. You know, that's when the end time really happens, when He judges the whole world, when He sets up His kingdom and all of that. We've grown to have an accustomed thought process to end times kind of thinking, if you've been around in the church at all. If you haven't, this might be new stuff, and I'll tell you, Daniel 7 is creepy, weird, freaky, strange, all of that rolled up into a ball. And it's because of this. God, for 6 chapters, has tried to communicate through Daniel and the stories about Him that He's in charge, no matter what it looks like. And that story's been communicated, that lesson's been communicated with stories. But when we get to chapter 7, God still wants to communicate that lesson, but he needs a different tactic, and so he chooses a completely different methodology to get that same lesson ingrained into our hearts, not just in our heads. And so as we flip to Daniel chapter 7, we immediately get confronted with a vision Daniel sees. Take a look. Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Now, this is interesting because up until this point, Daniel has been the interpreter of dreams. He interpreted a dream in chapter 2. He interpreted a dream in chapter 5. He interpreted a writing on a wall, weird kind of thing in Daniel 4 was a dream. Chapter 5 was the writing on the wall. Daniel's been the interpreter of dreams up until this point, but now he's getting a dream. That's flipping the story a little bit. This chapter 7, has some interesting features associated with it that I just want to draw your attention to because I think they're fascinating. Number one, Daniel 7 parallels Daniel 2 in one very clear way. We're about to see a vision of 4 different beasts who represent 4 different kingdoms. And in Daniel chapter 2, there was a dream of a 4-part statue that represented 4 different kingdoms. The statue had 4 different sections in it, and each section represented a different kingdom. So there was a dream about a 4-kingdom thing in chapter 2. Now in Daniel chapter 7, we're going to get another dream of a 4-kingdom thing. Secondarily, in Daniel chapter 2, something weird happens that we can't figure out in our English. It doesn't show up in our English translation because it's a language thing. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, the language changes from Hebrew to Aramaic because Aramaic was the business language of the day. Hebrew was Daniel's personal language, but Aramaic was the business language. And in chapter 2, verse 4, he switches over to Aramaic, and that persists all the way through Daniel 7. But at the end of Daniel 7, it switches back over to Hebrew. So for Daniel 2 through 7, it's all in Aramaic, the business language, the royal language of the day, because that section forms a section. And 2 through 7 are kind of bookends on that section. But at the same time, 2 is not a story. It's now the beginning of apocalyptic stuff, which means, 7 is not a story. It's the beginning of the apocalyptic stuff, which means it's beginning to transition us to the second half of the book. So what am I saying? I'm saying that Daniel 7 belongs to the first part of the book and to the second part of the book in a very unique way. In other words, it forms the center. Daniel 7 is the central chapter in this book, and it contains within it the central teaching of the entire book, made incredibly vivid for us. And hopefully today you will pick up on its vividness, and you will also pick up on the lesson. So we're going to spend most of our time in 7, then I'll hit 8 in only about 5 or 7 minutes. That we'll do 8 quickly, but 7, let's keep reading. All the way through verse 15. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire. and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch. Because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to list for you some of the details from this. And then we're going to try to unpack this as we go through it and try to figure out what it's all about, what it means. But it begins with Daniel seeing four winds. Four winds. This is north, south, east, west winds. These are winds that symbolize all the different directions. In other words, they symbolize the entire earth. They come from the entire earth to this place, the sea that he's looking at, which is probably in his mind the Great Sea or the Mediterranean Sea. In Daniel's mind, that would be the most impressive, most important sea. And so it's probably churning up what Daniel remembers from the Mediterranean Sea from back when he lived in Israel. And it's churning up the sea, and then out of the sea come these four beasts. And so here's your first thing. I'm going to give you a couple of these. Some of them will have blanks to write down, but the first one doesn't. It just says this: four winds churn up four beasts, and the last has a boastful little horn. Okay? So that's the first thing. That's the essence of his vision, the essence of his dream. Something else that's a little interesting along the side is that there are four winds, there are four beasts. There's one beast that has four wings and four heads, and the little horn displaces three other horns, so that means there's four kind of there. In other words, you get four showing up a whole lot. Keep looking to see if the interpretation shows up. Keep looking to figure out what it might mean. So the first thing is we see these four winds, four beasts, all of that. The next thing we see is the Ancient of Days is seated on a throne in glory and fire and wisdom. He is seated on a throne. And there's some interesting things about the throne. The throne has wheels. That means that he can be moved wherever he needs to go, and he can be the king no matter where he is. Or if he needs to be the king somewhere, the throne can be there too. You know, it's kind of maybe it's a symbol of God can be anywhere. You know, throne has wheels on it. Well, I don't know. We'll keep looking for the interpretation of the wheels. Figure out what happens later as we keep reading. But he's seated, and that's the part that I think is most fascinating. Because as a matter of fact, if you were Daniel, and you had seen a lion eagle come up out of the water towards you, and then you saw a humpback bear with bloody ribs in its mouth coming out of the water toward you, and then you saw a leopard that had four heads and four wings, dude, craziness, coming at you, and then you saw something else that doesn't even have an animal name. It's just called a terrible beast. It's a monster. It's like the creature from the Black Lagoon, who knows, but it's this crazy thing that has 10 horns on it, and you saw that beast coming at you. I have to ask you a question. Would you sit down? No. That's when I turn on the car engine, hit the gas, and be like, thank God for automobiles, because I'm out of here. See, when you see these beasts, your natural tendency is not to sit down. The only people who sit down when they're face to face with a beast are people who, A, have given up, people who don't care, or people who have no fear. See, the reason God is sitting is that there's no reason for him to stand. Even though there's all this turmoil in the world, even though there are these four beasts that are terrifying and scary, and Daniel himself is upset, and he's confused, and he's just absolutely out of his mind, crazed with this thing. I mean, it's terrifying to him. God's sitting. He's not afraid. He's not worried, not concerned. He's on the throne, and there's a whole bunch of fire coming out of this throne, and he's got books in front of him because God has the knowledge that he needs to deal with anything that comes his way. Okay, number 3. The fourth beast is destroyed in fire while the others linger. This is the place in the chapter where fire shows up. You know, fire is coming out of God's presence, and fire is the judgment place where the beast gets thrown and destroyed. And so you get that fire metaphor. You know, it goes with the theme of the series of messages. And then the last one is a son of man is given glory and authority and receives worship. And this one, for an ancient Israelite type of mind, would be utterly creepy, crazy weird. Because this is what it says. Daniel sees a vision, and the Ancient of Days is on the throne. Who has that got to be? It can only be God. Daniel sees it. He knows he's calling it the Ancient of Days, but he knows it's God. That's the creator of the universe. That's the one who fire comes before him. That's the one seated on the throne. That's the one who's totally in charge. And then one who looks like a man, looks like the son of just a man, walks into the presence of the Ancient of Days, approaches the throne of the Ancient of Days, which, I mean, there's confidence there. And then once he gets to the throne, he is given total and complete authority over the entire earth. And then everybody around him, angels, people, whoever's standing around him, worships him. That's the crazy part. Nowhere in the Old Testament do you ever find God sharing his worship with anyone. Worship never happens, if it's right, to a normal human being. You don't bow down before an idol. You don't bow down before a normal human being. And yet all these people are worshiping the one who looks like a son of man. Now, I don't have time to get into all this stuff. I'd like to actually spend our entire time just on that one passage, because that's really the reason why Daniel 7 is in the middle of Daniel, the book. It's the key. It's the highlight, the climax of everything that's going on in the book. And I'll get to that point in just a bit. But Jesus, you should know, when he is facing Caiaphas, the high priest, the day before he gets crucified, Caiaphas says to him, "So tell me, are you really the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "I am, and I tell you the truth, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with the angels in his glory." That's fascinating, because what Jesus says is, "I am the Son of Man who comes on clouds with the angels in glory." Oh yeah, Jesus was referring to Daniel chapter 7. Jesus takes this Son of Man passage, the one who comes before the Ancient of Days, receives glory, and then is worshipped. He claims it for himself. And he says, "I am the one with all authority, and I am the one who is to be worshipped as equivalent with God." Fascinating, utterly fascinating that in the Old Testament, in their total monotheism, there's room enough for this Son of Man to show up and be worshipped. No one really understood it. Daniel didn't understand it. He was troubled by it. And he was frustrated that he didn't understand all this stuff. And so let's just keep moving on. Let's find the explanation of all of this. In Daniel 7, beginning in verse 16, Daniel says, okay, I just had the vision. Now I want someone to tell me what it means. So verse 16, I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. Here's the interpretation. Are you ready? The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Period. End of quotation mark. He's done talking. I just saw a weird vision of like animals and lakes and, an ancient guy sitting on a throne and some confusing human being who now is worshipped. I just saw a crazy deal of detail, and you're telling me the interpretation of this vision is that kingdoms show up and then God's people get a forever kingdom. That's it? Go ahead and write it down, because that's the interpretation of the vision. Kingdoms will rise, but God's people get a forever kingdom. That's it. That's the end of the quotation. Tell me about the bear. Nope. Tell me about the leopard. Nope. What about the wheels on the throne? Not going to do it. Give me the details. And that's exactly what Daniel's feeling at this time. Keep reading, and Daniel's like, no. I wanted more information. Look at verse 19. He says, then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast. Okay, if you're not going to tell me about the lion, eagle, and the leopard and the bear, at least tell me about the creepy guy at the end with the horns and stuff. Okay, can you at least give me that much information? Then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. Now, here's the fascinating thing. Daniel says, no, I want more information. Let me remind you, I just saw this beast. It had 10 horns, and he narrates the whole thing to the angel. He's like talking to the angel. Okay, listen, I wanted details. I saw horns, and I saw this beast, and it was trampling a bunch of things, and he was attacking God's people. I want some details. I'm telling you the stuff I saw. Now give me the information. And the angel actually gives him a little more explanation. Look at this. Verse 23. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on the earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will rise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. That doesn't really help at all. It gives us a little more information. Now we know that the 10 horns symbolize individual kings, okay? But considering the whole animal was a kingdom, you probably could have guessed that. And now we know that the little horn at the end symbolizes a king. But since the other 10 were also kings, you could probably have guessed that. And we know that this last king is going to be in charge and rule over God's people for times. It's like, I want some details. Well, at least he gives us the number of times. There's a time, and then there's some times, and then there's a half a time. So we'll just call it 3.5, because at least that's the smallest number that covers time, times, and half a time. So write this down. The little horn has authority over God's people for 3.5 times. But God will overthrow him. So we have just got the same interpretation that we got before. The earlier interpretation was kingdoms will rise, God's people will be given a forever kingdom. I want more details. Okay, I'll give you more details. A king will arise, and God's people will be given a kingdom. And it's like, man, it's not what I wanted. And so at the very end of the story, that's one of the reasons why Daniel says in that last line in verse 28, he says, this is the end of the matter. I really couldn't get any more out of him. I tried. This is the end. Right then, they all left me. The vision was done. Somehow it's over. And he goes to bed upset, frustrated, and confused. That's not what I expect from Bible prophecy. See, the Bible told me already in the old part of the Old Testament, like Deuteronomy and Leviticus and areas like that, it had already told me that fortune telling is wrong. I can't go to a tarot card reader. I can't go to some other fortune teller. I can't read my horoscope. I can't do all this stuff because God plainly says it's all a lie of Satan or it's completely made up anyway. So either Satan is doing some type of deception or it's all made up, just don't bother with it. So he's told me I can't go to fortune tellers. So how am I supposed to know what tomorrow brings unless prophecy tells me? And so I come at the Bible and I want this stuff to give me details so that I know what's going to happen tomorrow. Because this is my only opportunity for fortune telling, right? When I was a kid, I was totally fascinated, absolutely fascinated by this whole Bible prophecy thing. There was a TV show that I watched. It was on the TBN network. You know, the network with televangelists and purple-haired women. If you've ever seen that show, the network, well, there was a show on that network that I loved. When I was in high school, a friend of mine turned me on to it, and every Saturday we would get together and we'd watch it. In fact, we spent money to purchase a series of tapes from this TV show that then we studied at my friend's house. We studied the tapes, and then we'd go out and jump on his trampoline, because, you know, that's the way we worked. But these tapes were all about prophecy, and it came from this guy, Jack Van Impe. This is Jack Van Impe and his wife, Rexella. I love that name. Jack Van Impe and Rexella. I think he's like 85 and still kicking right now. I don't know if the show's still on the air, but this is Jack. Here's how the show would work. It looked like a newsroom. And so Jack would be sitting at his news desk, and Rexella would be off to the side. And then she would pick up newspaper clippings or play video clips, or she would read a passage of the Bible, or she would just bring up a topic. And then once she did that, she would pass it over to Jack Van Impe, and Jack would spend 5-10 minutes, and his entire speech would just be a series of quoting Bible verses and Bible references. And he'd be rattling off Daniel 4, Daniel 7, Daniel 11, Matthew 24, Revelation 13. He'd just be hammering these things out there, you know, and he'd quote some of them and he'd reference others. And then he would be talking about how the thing that she just mentioned from the modern day news had been exactly predicted in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. And I remember watching this with rapt attention, like this guy is making the Bible feel like Nostradamus. You know, he's the dude who like supposedly predicted everything that was going to happen like thousands of years ago. And the Bible predates all that. This is awesome. I loved hearing Jack Van Impe tell me how everything that had ever happened in modern history was actually talked about in Daniel chapter 7 and other passages like that. And so I ate it up. I just wanted to know more. And then I've grown a little older now, and I've realized something about myself. I wanted Jack Van Impe to do all that work for me because I wanted Bible prophecy to be like Sudoku. I didn't know about Sudoku when I was a kid, but I know about it now. How many of you are fans of the Sudoku game? Okay? Some of you are nodding because someone next to you raised their hand. How many of you are addicted to Sudoku? Yeah, there are a few of you. Well, let me just illustrate to you. For those of you who don't know what Sudoku is, here's an easy one, okay? Some of you are looking at this and you're like, oh, it's so easy, I already got it. Some of you are looking at this and you're like, what is that? That's confusing. There's like boxes and numbers. Don't make me do math in church. Okay, well, there's no math involved. It just looks like math. You guys have already solved it, haven't you? So most Sudoku boards are like 9 rows and 9 columns, okay? And this is the easy one, the kind that I like to work with. So it's just a 4x4, and this is me trying to just explain it a little bit to you. There's one rule to the game of Sudoku, okay? Every row, every column, and every sub-box needs to have exactly one of each number. So if you have a 4x4 box, then your numbers go from 1 to 4. If you have a 9x9 box, your numbers go from 1 to 9. Every row needs exactly one of each number. Every column needs exactly one of each number, and every sub-box needs exactly one of each number. So if you look at the top left sub-box, the one that has the 2 and the 4 in it, if you look at that sub-box, we know it needs a 1 and it needs a 3. But the 1 can't be in the far left side because that column already has a 1, and you can only have 1 in the column. And the next one already has a 3 in that column. So the only possible way for those numbers to fit is for it to be 3 and then 1. How many of you already did this? Yep, that's right. And so for those of you who don't know about Sudoku, the same thing works as you go through the rest of it. 3, 4, 2 across the top, we know we need a 1 up there. And it has to be a 1 because every row needs exactly 1 of each number. So we just stick a 1 there, the next one gets a 4. Then we go to a sub box and 3, 2, 1, well, the next one has to be a 4. 4, 1, it needs a 2, so we get a 4 and a 2. And then we get the 3 and the 2 over there on the other side. So there's Sudoku for you. This is the kind of Sudoku most of you are familiar with. It's 9 by 9. I'm not going to leave it on the screen too long because you will be distracted. Some of you, while I'm talking, are like, you just keep talking, let me work on the puzzle. But, so here's the thing. Here's the thing about Sudoku, and I'll go ahead and leave it up there for you people to just ruminate on. Here's the thing about Sudoku. If you love Sudoku or not, it doesn't matter. It's never guessing. I never have to make something up. I never have to guess. If a Sudoku game is built properly, you can solve it entirely, 100% for sure, every single time, using pure logic alone. If you ever have to guess, you're not paying enough attention, or the board was built improperly. That's the way this thing works. And I look at the Bible and I'm like, I want the prophecy to be like a Sudoku game. Just go ahead and give me all the details. Let's connect all the dots. Let's get the picture. And there we go. It's logic. No guessing, no wondering, no confusion. Just give me the logic. Let's figure this thing out. Let's go for it. And guys like Jack Van Impe, when I was younger, convinced me that that could be done. And as we look at this passage, there's some details that I want to show you. Yeah, I took it away. Sorry. You can look at it later. I'll post it to our website or something. I just grabbed it off the internet. Just Google Sudoku. You'll find like a billion. So here's the deal. I'm going to go through the details of chapter 7, all right? Because that's what I want. I want to be able to put everything into a neat little tiny box. Number 1, the first detail we find, the lion eagle, and that represents Babylon. Because we already saw 4 kingdoms in previous dreams, in previous ones, and the first kingdom was always Babylon. Lion, eagle, also lion was used as a symbol of the country of Babylon. They used lions on their coins and stuff. They liked lions a lot. Anyway, and the fact that the lion gets its wings removed and then is later given the mind of a man kind of hints at what happened in Nebuchadnezzar when his power was taken away and then God restored his sanity. You know, it kind of hints at that, so let's go with it. Then the next one is the bear. The bear is taller on one side than the other. He's kind of hunched over. He's kind of limping or something. And that perfectly lines up with the Medo-Persian Empire because the Persians were stronger. The Medes were there first. But they kind of worked together, and that's sort of how the Medo-Persian Empire existed. So like a bear with a humpback, something like that. The third one is a leopard. And this leopard is fast, and it attacks with power. And it's perfectly in line with Greece. When Greece came on the scene, Alexander the Great conquered the whole ancient world in like 3 years. So, I mean, fast-paced, that's the leopard. And then comes this monster. And the monster has got to be Rome, because the only big national power that existed after the Greece Empire was Rome. So, it's got to be Rome. But there's a problem when you get to the horns. The horns are just a whole bunch of question marks. Because Rome didn't have 10 kings. And it didn't have like one king who stepped up to be extra wicked. It had a lot of kings who were extra wicked, but it didn't have one of them who stepped up to be extra wicked. Funnily enough, Greece did have a king who stepped up to be extra wicked. His name was Antiochus. And we'll talk about him in just a couple minutes. So some people have said, oh, I know, the last monster has to be Greece because it had one king who stepped up and was extra wicked. So that means that the Medes and Persians must be separate entities. So that means the bear must be Medes, and the leopard is Persia, and then the monster is Greece. And it's all coming because the horns have question marks. And once you get to an unknown, this is what happens. We're no longer playing Sudoku. Once you get to an unknown, it's not just logic. And so the sky's the limit for people to guess. And for people to say, I think this is what's going on. I think this is what's going on. And so one group of people, they begin to debate the history. What do these things really connect to? Other people get to debate the accuracy. Maybe Daniel didn't really get a vision. Maybe he just made this up. Maybe someone else made it up later. And then other people do something crazy with it. They get all eschatological about it. You know what that word means? Yeah, it's a big one. It means end times. It means the apocalypse of Revelation, when God comes and he does the cosmic beatdown on everybody. That's what eschatological means. It's the end times. And so they say that little horn must be in the future. Jack Van Impe would say that little horn is this Antichrist who's going to show up at some point in the future, and then he's going to really get mad at all God's people and this, that, and the other thing. Well, you know what it does? It takes a nice, neat, tight little game of Sudoku, and it turns into this travesty. I saw someone, literally, I'm not even joking with you, I saw someone in this room playing this game on his tablet before the service started. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Do you know what this game is? This is a game that pretends to be logical. It makes you think you're logical. This is Minesweeper, and you do this thing, and you're like, oh, there are numbers. I have to figure stuff out. And then finally you realize there's a place where you can't make anything except for blindly clicking in a blank box and hoping and praying. So the small ones, when there's only 10 bombs, yeah, I can get that mostly with logic usually. But then you come up to this one, and you've got the bigger one. This is the normal one. It's like the 40 bomb kind of thing. And you start by randomly clicking somewhere on the box, and then it kind of opens up for you, and you're like, ooh, I just accomplished something. And then it's like, now what? So you do your logic thing, and there's always a place where you come to that question of, I don't know the next thing to do. So you pick something at random, and for me, it always ends up like this. Bombs everywhere. Bum, bum, bum. See, I want prophecy to work like Sudoku, but it doesn't. You look at it, and it ends up being like Minesweeper. And you're like, really? Is that what God wants me to get out of this? You can make all kinds of connections. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 talks about a man of lawlessness who's going to show up at the end of time. Matthew 24 talks about things. 1 John talks about an antichrist. Revelation 13 talks about a beast who shows up at the end of time, and he's kind of like the key world ruler or something like that. And it's like you see that all over the place. Let's draw the dots, draw the lines, connect the dots, that kind of stuff. But let me just stop you there for a second and ask you, did God give Daniel chapter 7 because Sudoku hadn't been invented yet? Did God give Daniel chapter 7 because he was bored and Minesweeper, Microsoft wasn't around? Did God do this for Daniel? Here are your three options. Either God's playing a practical joke on Daniel, and God's like, hey, I'll just confuse you. Lots of beasts, lots of crazy things, horns. Go ahead and ask me. I ain't going to tell you. Let's just, is God playing a practical joke? No, I don't think so. Is God trying to give Daniel a whole bunch of clues and questions that he needs to work out on his own? What is it? Sudoku, Minesweeper, practical joke? I think it's something different. So here's what I'm going to tell you. When it comes to prophecy, always come back to this question. Why did God say this to the person he said it to? Why did God say this to the person he said it to? And so look at Daniel. How does he respond? In verse 15 and in verse 28, he has the same response. Troubled. I was troubled. I was in anguish. Daniel goes to sleep confused. Now I got to ask you, if God wanted Daniel to know something, if God wanted Daniel to understand something, would Daniel have gone to sleep that night all in confusion? Do you think our God is powerful enough, strong enough, and smart enough that he can figure out how to explain a vision to someone if he wants to? Do you think that angel didn't know what the answer was? Do you think the angel intentionally said what he said because that's all that needed to be said? You see, when we look at prophecy, we want all kinds of details, just like Daniel did. And yet, Daniel's response is an emotional one. See, ultimately, the response Daniel gives in this passage is what God was trying to accomplish. God wanted Daniel to feel a sense of burden. In other words, God wanted Daniel not to know something, but to feel something. He wanted him to feel something. And what? Well, let's talk about that little horn, okay? Just think about this. The little horn represents a king. What does the king do? Let's just remind ourselves of the story. This king shows up on the scene by defeating other kings. Then he's all boastful and starts talking about stuff like he's all that. He starts making decrees and pretending he's in charge. Then he starts changing laws that oppose God's people. Then, after he's changing laws and opposing God's people, eventually God shows up and he judges the king. And then when all is said and done, God's people get their kingdom back. Who does that sound like? Well, if you've been paying attention, it sounds like every king we've looked at so far in the book of Daniel. Daniel, at this point, has already experienced Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. He soon will experience Darius, and all three of them fit at least that much of the little horn prophecy. As a matter of fact, almost every king who's ever lived has had a little bit of the little horn going on in their life. You know why? Because it always happens. It's commonplace. It's not just unique. It's not just one key guy who's so bad that he would put himself up against God. It's everyone in power. Everyone who gets to that place has the choice to make of, am I going to go my way or God's way? And when they make that decision to go their own way rather than God's way, they become that little horn. This isn't just about some future kingdom and one person. This is about all the authority that's going on for the rest of history. Let me put it to you this way. Jot this down, fill out the blank this way. God doesn't want us to know something as much as He wants us to feel something. He wants us to feel sure that tyrants will rise and oppress God's people, but God is on the throne. The Son will triumph, and the faithful will have a kingdom. God wants us to feel sure that tyrants will rise and oppress God's people, but God is on the throne. The Son will triumph, and the faithful will have a kingdom. Tyrants rise all the time. Now, granted, if tyrants rise all the time, then if God ever brings an end to the way this world works, and He promises us He will, then there will be one last one. It just stands to reason. But the details in Daniel are not meant for us to try to decipher who and when is the last one. The details in Daniel are meant to communicate to us one key thing and one key thing above all others. That tyrants do come, they do show up, they do fight against God's people, but don't worry, because God's still on His throne. The King, the Son, will be victorious, and we will eventually be given the kingdom. Okay, with all that said, we've covered a lot of ground right there, and, I've been talking for a little over half an hour. So you're like, okay, another chapter? Yeah, well, this chapter goes quickly for two reasons. A, it gives us a lot of detail. And so I don't have to explain a lot because it actually explains it right here. So we're just going to read it. It'll explain most of itself. And then number two, when we get to the end of it, we're kind of given a command that we're not supposed to explain it. So here we go. Chapter 8, let's go ahead and just read the whole thing. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal. And the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in a great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great. But at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens. and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking. And another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man, and I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future." I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. Now, the reason this is going to go fast is that these details have already happened. As a matter of fact, chapter 8 is an amazingly detailed account of what actually happened in history between the Mede-Persian Empire and the Grecian Empire. See, in 333 BC, Alexander the Great came on the scene, and he was the king of the Greek peoples at the time. And he, in 3 years, pretty much conquered the entire ancient world, all the way from northern Greece all the way over to Persia. He was in charge of the entire ancient world. And so he did that fast, like a goat just running around, getting it all done, if it's like this fast goat here. And so that's Alexander. One big horn in the center conquered everything. But then when Alexander died, and he died very young, 4 kings sprung up to control the different quadrants of his kingdom. No individual king decided to be in charge, tried to be in charge, but they couldn't be in charge. It was all these different 4. But then eventually, one guy came to power in 168 BC, a guy by the name of Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes was his nickname. And Antiochus was an especially wicked man, deciding that everybody needed to worship not just his way, but also him. He set up in the temple of Jerusalem a statue to Zeus, and then in front of the temple, on the altar of God, he sacrificed a pig. And for the ancient Jewish people, that was the most atrocious thing that could be done. An idol, a foreign god, and a pig sacrifice, all in their temple. It desecrated the temple. He did that in 168 BC. When he did that, he canceled the daily and evening sacrifices. Because back then, the way it worked is that there was a sacrifice done every morning and a sacrifice done every evening. And so when you cancel the daily sacrifices, that means you're canceling 2 sacrifices per day. And then, 3 years later, roughly 2,300 sacrifices later, a man by the name of Judas Maccabeus led a group of people to invent Hanukkah. Actually, that's what happened. But it wasn't about the holiday, it was about the temple. They cast out Antiochus and all of his followers. They conquered them. They swept them away. They cleaned up the temple. And on December 14th, 164 BC, Judas Maccabeus rededicated the temple of God. Roughly 3 years, roughly 2,300 sacrifices after Antiochus had desecrated the temple. Now, the details found in this prophecy, Daniel chapter 8, are so clearly aligned with the details of what actually happened in history that we should stand back and go, whoa. This had to have come from God. But there's a problem. 3 times the angel Gabriel tells Daniel that these concern the days of the end. And then he does this weird thing. He says, you know these days that I just told you about, the vision of the evenings and the mornings, the 2,300 evenings and morning sacrifices things? You know that vision? Guess what? Seal it up, verse 26. Seal it up, put it in a box, set it off to the side, because it concerns the distant future. Chapter 8 is when Daniel starts writing in Hebrew again, because he no longer needs this to get out to the common world. He's going to keep this just to the Hebrew people, the Israelite people, the Jewish people. And so he starts writing it in Hebrew. That adds it to the secrecy of the moment. But the angel says, listen, just pack it up. Set it off to the side. Don't worry too much about it. It concerns the time of the end. So you and I look at it and we're like, Daniel chapter 8 already happened. That's awesome. That's a prophecy. We can draw all the lines. That's a prophecy. We can put it in our Sudoku box. That's a prophecy we know all the answers to. Yay, God. Yay, God. Oh, but it's about the end. Criminy. So it happened, but it's supposed to happen. It needs to be sealed up because we're not supposed to know the details. Here's the bottom line. God doesn't want you to know details when He gives you prophecy. He wants you to be prepared when He gives you prophecy. And when He gives you prophecy, He wants you to feel something, to know something, that even though tyrants rise, He's still on His throne, and He's still in charge. And even though this prophecy can already happen, it's just because that's the way wicked people work. There are little horns like that show up all the time, and God is still in charge. Let me give you 3 final things, lessons for prophecy when you come across an Old Testament passage like this. 3 lessons for prophecy. Number 1, the accuracy of prophecies confirm their divine origin. You should walk away from this place going like, wow, God, you're awesome that you've given us a Bible that has prophecy that actually came true. Number 2, prophecies were not given to prepare us mentally, but emotionally. They're not meant to give us all the details we need so we can know the future because that's somehow cool. They're meant to prepare you so that when the future happens, you're ready for it. And number 3, prophecies reveal to us the way things really are through something that scholars call typology. What that means is it means when God gives you a prophecy like a little horn, it doesn't just mean that one moment. It means something is real that might actually happen then, and something is real that might happen later, and something is true about the way things actually are that might reveal itself over the span of human history. And so Matthew chapter 24 quotes Jesus as saying this, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, ... he's talking about chapter 8 that already happened. But he tells his disciples, when you see it happen. What? It's because it's about the end. It's because the way wicked people work and the way you and I work if God's not in charge of our lives is that we do this kind of stuff. Is we go our own way. And we follow these paths that always lead down the same road. It's the way things really are. So here's the lesson for you and me to take home. If you're going to be a follower of God, do not be surprised if you face fiery trials. Because God is still in charge, and He will win. What's happened before will happen once more. It's the way things are. It's the way things go. It's not our job to know the details. It's our job to be ready when it comes. Don't be surprised if you face fiery trials, because God is still in charge, and He's going to win. Let me invite you to spend some time jotting down some thoughts on the Connect card and to Think about what this means in your life. Are you facing a trial? Maybe you've got an Antiochus kind of dude in your life right now who seems to be opposing God and you're not sure what to do. Well, at least trust this. God is in charge and He's going to win. But maybe you're in a place right now where you're resistant to God's will in your life. And I need to let you know, if you're resisting God's will in your life, He's in charge and He's going to win. So let me give you some time to just reflect, put some thoughts down on the card. We'll sing a final song, and during that final song, we'll pass our baskets. Put the card in there as a symbol of your commitment to God and your connection to what He's doing here in this place. And let me close our time by praying for you. Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.